The screaming started at 9:47 p.m. on October 13th, 1960. I know the exact time because I was watching the hands of my Mickey Mouse clock praying they would move faster when my bedroom door burst open. "Jessica." Tony's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Time for our special game." I was 9 years old clutching my stuffed rabbit when my brother first taught me that monsters don't live under beds. They sleep in the room next to yours. My name is Jessica Smith now, but I was born Jessica Randall in Oak Ridge, Tennessee in 1951. This is the story of how I died at 9 and was reborn at 15, carrying a secret that would shape 3 generations. The Randall house on Elm Street looked normal from the outside. White picket fence, rose bushes, American flag on the porch. Inside lived my father John, a nuclear technician who believed children should be seen and not heard. My mother Martha, whose bruises told stories she never spoke aloud. My brother Tony, 5 years older and perfect in everyone's eyes but mine and me. The unwanted daughter who would grow up to understand that sometimes the only way to save your child is to destroy yourself. That October night, as Tony's weight pressed down on my small body and his hand covered my mouth, I learned my first survival lesson. When you can't escape hell, you learn to fly above it. I became a bird soaring high above a little girl who couldn't be me because I was flying away from the pain that was tearing my soul apart. This is our secret," Tony whispered afterward, smoothing my hair with mock tenderness. "If you tell anyone, and I mean anyone, I'll tell Daddy you've been bad with the neighborhood boys. You know what happens to bad girls in this house." I knew. I'd seen Mama's split lips often enough. As Tony crept back to his bed, leaving me bleeding and broken, something crystallized in my 9-year-old mind, a thought that would sustain me through the hell to come. Someday, I'll be strong enough to fight back. Someday, I'll save us both. I didn't know then that us both would include a child I had yet to conceive. Morning brought no relief, only a new performance. At breakfast, Tony buttered toast for me with theatrical concern, while Daddy read aloud from his newspaper about the space race. "That's my boy." Daddy beamed as Tony helped clear dishes. "Always thinking of family, not like some people who just take up space." His eyes flicked to me with casual contempt. In John Randall's world, daughters were accidents waiting to disappoint. Mama bustled around the kitchen, her movements careful and measured. A purple bruise peeked from beneath her collar last night's discussion about overcooking the pot roast. She caught me staring and quickly adjusted her blouse. "Jessica, honey, eat your eggs before they get cold," she said softly. Tony sat across from me, the picture of innocence, but I caught the warning in his green eyes. "Remember our secret." After Daddy left for the nuclear plant, Tony cornered me by the back door. "I've been thinking about our game last night," he said, his voice casual as discussing weather. "We should play it more often. What do you think, little sister?" I wanted to scream, to run, to tell Mama everything. Instead, I nodded silently, already understanding that resistance would only make it worse. School became my sanctuary, the one place Tony's influence couldn't reach me directly. My teacher, Miss Peterson, sometimes asked why I seemed so tired, why my grades were slipping, why I flinched when she touched my shoulder. "Everything all right at home, Jessica?" "Yes, ma'am. Just didn't sleep well." How could I explain that sleep meant vulnerability? That every night was a countdown to horror? But Miss Peterson persisted with gentle questions, and slowly over weeks I began to trust her. She had kind eyes and never raised her voice even when Jimmy Morrison put gum in Sally's hair. One afternoon, as she helped me with arithmetic, I found the courage to speak. "Miss Peterson, what happens when someone hurts you, but says it's a secret?" She set down her red pen and studied my face. "What kind of hurt, sweetheart?" My 9-year-old vocabulary failed me. How could I explain things that didn't have names I knew? "Bad touching," I whispered. Miss Peterson's expression grew very serious. "Jessica, has someone been touching you inappropriately?" I nodded, tears flowing freely now. "Who, honey, you can tell me?" My brother Tony. The words hung in the air between us. Miss Peterson reached for my hand, her touch gentle and safe. Jessica, I need you to be very brave. I'm going to call someone who can help us, okay? That afternoon, a social worker named Mrs. Campbell came to school. She had short gray hair and spoke in soothing tones as she asked me to repeat my story. I told her everything: the nighttime visits, the special games, Tony's threats about telling Daddy. You're very brave to tell us, Mrs. Campbell said. Now I need to speak with your parents. This isn't your fault, Jessica. Adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them. Hope bloomed in my chest for the first time in months. Finally, someone believed me. Finally, help was coming. But my hope died 3 hours later when Daddy stormed into our house, his face purple with rage. Jessica! His bellow shook the windows. Get in here now! I crept into the living room to find Daddy, Mama, Tony, and Mrs. Campbell arranged like actors on a stage. Tony's face was a perfect mask of hurt confusion. This woman, Daddy spat, says you've been telling lies about your brother. Disgusting lies. Mrs. Campbell tried to intervene. Mr. Randall, children rarely fabricate these types of allegations. My daughter, Daddy's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, is a liar and a troublemaker. Always has been. And my son Tony is a good boy who'd never hurt a fly. Tony stepped forward, his performance flawless. Mrs. Campbell, I love my little sister. Maybe she's confused because I help her with baths sometimes or tuck her in at night. I was just trying to be a good big brother. The social worker looked between us, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Tony was so handsome, so articulate, so convincing. I was a small, frightened girl with a reputation for daydreaming. Perhaps, Mrs. Campbell said carefully, we should arrange for Jessica to speak with a counselor. No. Daddy's voice was final. My family doesn't need outsiders poking around. This ends here. Mrs. Campbell left with promises to monitor the situation, but I knew she wouldn't return. Daddy was John Randall, respected nuclear technician deacon at First Baptist pillar of the community. I was just a 9-year-old girl with an overactive imagination. That night, Tony's visit to my room was brutal beyond anything I'd experienced before. You little bitch, he hissed as he hurt me in ways that left no visible marks. You tried to destroy our family, but nobody will ever believe you again. Nobody. He was right. My one chance at rescue had failed, and now I knew the truth. I was completely alone. The years that followed taught me survival skills no child should need. I learned to read Tony's moods, to anticipate his needs, to make myself small and invisible when his attention turned dangerous. I perfected the art of disappearing inside my own mind, creating elaborate fantasy worlds where brave princesses rescued themselves. By age 12, I developed an early warning system for Tony's approaches. The creak of the third floorboard meant he was coming. The sound of his bedroom door closing too softly meant he was planning something. The smell of beer on his breath meant the assault would be worse than usual. I also learned practical defenses. I started sleeping in multiple layers of clothes, making it harder for him to undress me quickly. I kept a glass of water by my bed and claimed frequent stomach bugs that sent me running to the bathroom when I heard him coming. I became expert at feigning deep sleep, hoping he'd lose interest and leave. But Tony was patient and persistent. He always found ways around my defenses. Getting smarter, aren't you? He'd whisper after particularly violent episodes. But I'm always smarter. My body began changing at 13, developing curves that attracted Tony's increased attention and Daddy's disgusted commentary about girls getting ideas above their station. Look at her, Martha, Daddy would say as I walked past. Putting on airs like she's something special. Better keep a close eye on that one. Mama would nod silently, but sometimes I caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part fear, part recognition, part helpless love. It was around this time that I met Rose Patterson, whose family had moved to Oak Ridge from Nashville. Rose was everything I wasn't confident, talkative, unafraid of her own shadow. Her parents actually listened when she spoke, actually seemed to enjoy her company. "Your brother's so handsome," Rose confided one day as we walked home from school. "All the girls talk about him. Mama says he'll make some lucky girl a wonderful husband." The words made my stomach turn, but I managed a weak smile. "He's not as nice as people think. Oh, all big brothers are pests. Mine puts dead bugs in my bed and tells Mama I broke things I didn't break. But they grow out of it." I wanted desperately to tell her it wasn't the same thing, that Tony's cruelty went far beyond typical sibling rivalry. But the memory of Mrs. Campbell's failed intervention kept me silent. That night, Tony cornered me in the pantry while I helped Mama with canning. "I saw you talking to that Patterson girl," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "What were you discussing?" "Nothing important, just school stuff." His hand shot out, gripping my wrist until I gasped. "Don't lie to me, Jessica. I can always tell when you're lying." "We talked about homework and boys," I admitted quickly. "Boys." Tony's grip tightened. "What about boys?"
"She said you were handsome, that's all."
Tony studied my face for a long moment, then released my wrist. "Good, because you know what happens to little girls who spread lies about their families, don't you?" "Yes," I whispered. "And you know what happens to anyone who tries to help them?" The threat was clear. Rose and her family would pay the price for any attempt I made to seek help. From that day forward, I kept my distance from potential friends. Tony had made it clear that my pain was mine alone to bear, and involving others would only create more victims. At 14, my body betrayed me in the most devastating way possible. I missed my first period in January 1965, then my second in February. By March, the morning nausea and swelling breasts made the truth undeniable: I was carrying Tony's child. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Pregnant at 14. Pregnant with my brother's baby, a child who would also be my nephew or niece. The horror was so complete, so overwhelming, that I spent entire days in a dissociative haze, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of my situation. But beneath the shock and revulsion, another emotion began to grow: fierce, protective love. Whatever the circumstances of conception, this innocent life inside me deserved protection. Deserved better than the hell I'd been living. I became expert at hiding my condition. I wore Daddy's oversized shirts and tied strips of cloth around my expanding waist, pulling them tight enough to create a flatter silhouette. I learned to walk differently, to carry books strategically positioned to hide my growing belly, to time bathroom visits when no one was watching. The hardest part was avoiding Tony's continued assaults while pregnant. I started taking mild poison ivy leaves and rubbing them on my skin to create rashes that made him reluctant to touch me. I claimed frequent stomach flu episodes that sent me running to the bathroom whenever he approached. I even began sleeping in the root cellar some nights despite the spiders and cold, because it was the one place Tony wouldn't think to look. But my expanding belly couldn't be hidden forever. Mama noticed first, of course. Mothers always do. It was during a particularly violent morning sickness episode that she found me retching behind the house, my school dress hiked up as I tried to catch my breath. "Oh, sweet Jesus," she whispered, staring at the unmistakable curve of my belly. "Jessica, baby, how far along?" 4 months, I admitted through tears. Mama's face crumpled. She pulled me into her arms, both of us sobbing in the dirt behind our house. "Ooh," she whispered, though I could see in her eyes that she already knew. This was my moment. I could tell the truth, reveal Tony's crimes, expose the monster who'd stolen my childhood and now threatened my child's future. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I heard Tony's whistle as he approached from the direction of the barn. The sound froze my blood, reminding me of all his threats, all the ways he could hurt us both if the truth came out. "Mike Patterson," I heard myself say. From the grocery store. Mike Patterson, a sweet 16-year-old boy who'd never done anything worse than smile shyly when our paths crossed at his family's store. Mike, who would now become the scapegoat for Tony's crimes. Mama's relief was visible. A teenage pregnancy by a neighborhood boy was scandalous but manageable. Incest was unthinkable, unspeakable, unforgivable. "We'll figure something out," she whispered quickly as Tony rounded the corner. "We'll think of something." But what was there to figure out? I was 14, pregnant, and trapped in a house with my rapist? There were no good options, no clean solutions. The confrontation with Daddy was every bit as horrible as I'd imagined. When he finally noticed my condition impossible to hide at 6 months, his rage was nuclear. Whore. The word echoed through the house like a gunshot. My own daughter, a common whore. I sat in the corner of our tiny living room arms, wrapped protectively around my swollen belly, as Daddy raged about family honor and neighborhood gossip, and the shame I'd brought on the Randall name. Tony's performance was masterful. He played the concerned big brother, perfectly expressing shock and disappointment at his sister's poor choices, while subtly reinforcing the lie about Mike Patterson. "I tried to warn you about that boy, Daddy," Tony said, with exactly the right mixture of regret and loyalty. But Jessica wouldn't listen. You know how teenage girls get about older boys? Within hours, Daddy had stormed over to the Patterson store, making wild accusations and threats. The confrontation was public and ugly, drawing crowds of neighbors and customers who witnessed John Randall's fury at the boy who'd defiled his daughter. Mike's parents, terrified and bewildered by the accusations, tried to defend their son's innocence. But the damage was done. Within a week, facing social ostracism and Daddy's continuing threats, the Patterson family packed up and fled Oak Ridge, leaving behind their business and their reputation. I watched them load their belongings into a moving truck, my heart breaking for the innocent family destroyed by my lies. Mike caught my eye through the truck's rear window as they drove away, confusion and hurt written across his young face. That night, as I lay in bed feeling my baby move inside me, I made a solemn promise. Somehow, someday, I would make this right. I would save my child from this poisonous family legacy, even if it cost me everything. Charles entered the world on September 23, 1965, after 18 hours of labor that nearly killed us both. Mama delivered him on my narrow bed, using skills learned from years of helping other women birth their babies in secret. "Push, baby girl," she coached through her own tears. "One more time, I can see his head." When Charles finally slipped into Mama's waiting hands, tiny, perfect, and absolutely beautiful, something shifted inside my chest. The love that crashed over me was instant, overwhelming, and pure in a way I'd never experienced. "He's perfect," Mama whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Jessica, he's absolutely perfect." Charles had dark hair like Tony's, but my brown eyes, instead of those cold green ones that had haunted my nightmares. As I held him for the first time, feeling his tiny fingers curl around mine, I made another promise: this child would never know the darkness that created him. He would grow up believing in love, safety, and his own inherent worth. Tony appeared in the doorway within minutes, ostensibly to check on his nephew, but really to assert his claim over both of us. "Handsome boy," he said softly, his eyes moving between Charles and me. "Good Randall genes. He'll be just like his uncle when he grows up." The possessiveness in his voice made my skin crawl. "He'll be nothing like you," I said quietly, surprising myself with my boldness. Tony's smile turned cold. "We'll see about that, won't we? After all, I'll be around to help raise him, to teach him how to be a man." The threat was clear and terrifying. Tony didn't just want to continue abusing me, he wanted to shape my son to potentially turn him into another predator or victim. That night, as I nursed Charles and listened to his soft breathing, I knew with absolute certainty that we had to escape. Not someday, not eventually, but soon. Before Tony could corrupt my innocent child, before this house could poison another generation. But how I was 15 years old with no money, no education, and a newborn baby. I was completely dependent on my family for survival, trapped as effectively as if I'd been locked in a cell. The answer would come from an unexpected source, but first I had to survive the months ahead. Eleanor Wilson was nothing like the other ladies of Oak Ridge. While they gossiped over church suppers and competed over garden clubs, she drove her own car, managed her own finances, and spoke her mind whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. The widow of a Manhattan project scientist, Mrs. Wilson, lived alone in the grandest house on Magnolia Street, surrounded by gardens that made the other women green with envy. She was educated, well-traveled, and stubbornly independent, everything proper Southern women weren't supposed to be. Most of the town ladies whispered about her behind perfectly manicured hands, calling her peculiar and too big for her britches. But Mrs. Wilson seemed to thrive on their disapproval. Our first real conversation happened at the post office when Charles was 3 months old. I was struggling to manage him while mailing Mama's insurance papers, and he was fussing from hunger and heat. "Here, let me help you with that," Mrs. Wilson said, taking control of my packages with effortless grace. "Babies can be quite the handful, can't they?" "Yes, ma'am, thank you." She studied me with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. "You look tired, dear. Are you getting enough help at home?" The simple question nearly broke me. When was the last time anyone had asked about my well-being? "I manage fine," I said automatically. Mrs. Wilson's expression suggested she didn't believe me, but she didn't push. Instead, she began appearing at strategic moments at the grocery store, when I couldn't reach items on high shelves at the pharmacy, when I was counting pennies for Charles's medicine at church when I needed someone to hold him during particularly long sermons. She never asked prying questions or offered unwanted advice. She simply helped quietly and consistently in ways that made my life marginally easier without making me feel like charity. After several weeks of these chance encounters, Mrs. Wilson made an observation that changed everything. "You seem like someone carrying a heavy burden," she said one afternoon as we sat on a bench outside the courthouse, Charles sleeping peacefully in my arms. "Heavier than any young woman should have to bear alone." I glanced around nervously, making sure no one could overhear us. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Her voice was gentle but firm. "And I want you to know something, Jessica. If you ever need help, real help, not just groceries and kind words, you know where to find me." "What kind of help?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. "The kind that gives young mothers and their children a chance at a different life. I have resources, connections, experience helping women in complicated situations, and I believe every person deserves the opportunity to choose their own path." That night, I lay awake thinking about her words. Resources, connections, a different life. Could it be possible? Could there really be a way out of this nightmare? But even as hope began to bloom, fear followed close behind. What would Tony do if he discovered I was planning to leave? What would Daddy do? And how could I possibly survive in the world with nothing but a baby and whatever help a kind widow could provide? Over the following weeks, Mrs. Wilson and I began meeting in secret. She'd suggested I bring Charles for afternoon tea, which provided perfect cover for our real purpose, planning my escape. Her house was a revelation. Books lined every wall, from floor to ceiling. Newspapers from major cities were scattered across elegant furniture, and photographs from her travels created a gallery of possibilities I'd never imagined. "I never had children of my own," she explained during one visit, watching Charles play with wooden toys that probably cost more than my family's monthly budget. "Harold and I tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. So I've made it my mission to help young mothers who find themselves in difficult circumstances." She was tactful enough not to pry into the exact nature of my circumstances, but I sensed she suspected the truth was more complicated than the story about Mike Patterson. "I have connections in Washington, D.C., she continued. "Organizations that specialize in helping women start fresh. New identities, job training, housing assistance, everything you'd need to build a completely new life." New identity. The words sent shivers down my spine. To become someone else entirely, someone with no connection to the Randall family or their poisonous legacy. What would I have to do? First, we'd arrange proper documentation. Birth certificate, social security card, school records, everything Jessica Smith would need to exist legally. It's perfectly legitimate, just a matter of paperwork and bureaucracy. Jessica Smith. I tested the name silently, imagining how it would feel to introduce myself without the weight of shame and secrets. The organization provides temporary housing and financial support while you learn job skills, Mrs. Wilson continued. It's not easy. You'd be working hard, learning fast, building everything from nothing. But it would be yours, Jessica. Truly yours. How long would it take to arrange? A month, perhaps 2. We need to be careful and thorough. One mistake could ruin everything. A month felt like an eternity when every day brought new risks of discovery or assault. But I knew she was right. If we were going to do this, we had to do it perfectly. There's one more thing, Mrs. Wilson said, her expression growing serious. Once you make this choice, there's no going back. You'd be cutting ties with your family permanently. No contact, no visits, no word about your whereabouts or well-being. It's the only way to ensure your safety. The thought of never seeing Mama again broke my heart, but I knew it was necessary. As long as any connection remained to the Randall family, Tony would find a way to exert control over my life. What about money? I asked. I'll need something to start with. Mrs. Wilson waved dismissively. That's already arranged. The organization provides initial funding, and there are job placement programs specifically for women in your situation. You're intelligent and determined, Jessica. You'll succeed. As I walked home that evening with Charles babbling happily in my arms, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope. For the first time since my pregnancy began, I could envision a future where Charles and I were truly free. But our window of opportunity would prove smaller than either of us anticipated. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late February. I was feeding Charles when Tony announced that he'd been talking to some of his friends about career opportunities. Billy Morrison's older brother works for a private investigation firm in Knoxville, Tony said casually, too casually. Says they're always looking for people who know how to find information about folks, track down missing persons, that sort of thing. My blood turned to ice. Was Tony planning something, or was I being paranoid? The second sign came 3 days later, when Mrs. Patterson, Mike's aunt, who'd stayed in Oak Ridge, approached me at the grocery store with tears in her eyes. Jessica, honey, I need you to know something, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. Mike's been having nightmares ever since y'all left Nashville. Keeps saying he never touched you, never even held your hand. His mama's worried sick about him. Guilt crashed over me like a physical weight. An innocent boy was suffering because of my lies, and there was nothing I could do to fix it without destroying Charles's future. I'm sorry, I whispered, meaning it more than she could ever know. Mrs. Patterson studied my face with knowing eyes. Honey, I've lived long enough to recognize when someone's carrying secrets they shouldn't have to carry alone. If you ever need to talk to someone who won't judge. But before I could respond, Tony appeared at my elbow as if summoned by dark magic. Mrs. Patterson, he said with that charming smile that fooled everyone. How nice to see you. I hope your family is settling well in their new location. The barely veiled threat was unmistakable. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, and she hurried away without another word. Interesting conversation, Tony asked as we walked home. She was just being polite. I'm sure she was. But Jessica... His hand gripped my elbow just tight enough to hurt. You know how important it is for our family to maintain our reputation in this town. Certain conversations could be misunderstood. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't wait for Mrs. Wilson's careful timeline. Whatever the risks, Charles and I had to leave Oak Ridge immediately. But Tony, it seemed, was one step ahead of me. It was Daddy who announced the news that would seal our fate, at least temporarily. Got word from the plant today, he said over dinner, his voice unusually cheerful. "They're sending me and Tony to a special training program in Atlanta. Government contract work, very hush-hush. We'll be gone for 2 weeks." 2 weeks. 14 days without Tony's presence, without his constant surveillance, without the immediate threat of assault. It seemed like a gift from heaven. "When do you leave?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Tomorrow morning early. The car's already packed." I caught Mama's eye across the table and saw understanding pass between us. This was our chance, perhaps our only chance. That night, after Daddy and Tony had retired to their rooms, I slipped into the kitchen where Mama was finishing the dishes. "Mama," I whispered, "I need to tell you something." She set down her dish rag and turned to face me, her expression already heavy with dread. "Charles isn't Mike Patterson's baby." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mama's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, dawning horror, and finally, a crushing sadness that seemed to age her 10 years in an instant. "Who?" she whispered, though I could see she already knew. "Tony." Mama's knees buckled, and I caught her arm to steady her. We sank onto the kitchen chairs together, both of us crying silently. "I knew," she sobbed. "God help me, I suspected, and I did nothing. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." "Mama, listen to me. I have a chance to get away to take Charles somewhere safe. But I need your help." Through her tears, she looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years: determination. "What do you need?" Over the next hour, I told her about Mrs. Wilson's plan, about the organizations in Washington that helped women like me. I explained that I would have to disappear completely, that she might never see Charles or me again. "It's the only way to keep him safe," I said through my own tears. "As long as we're here, Tony will always have power over us." Mama was quiet for a long time, processing everything I'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than I'd heard it in years. "Your grandmother left me some jewelry when she passed. It's not much, but real gold is worth something in big cities. And I have a little money hidden away, not much but enough for train tickets and a few weeks' expenses." "Mama." "No, Jessica. I failed you in every way that matters. I let that monster hurt you because I was too scared and too weak to stop it. This is the least I can do to try and make it right." We spent the rest of that night planning. Mama would tell everyone that Charles and I had gone to visit her fictitious sister in Memphis, a lie that would buy us precious time before anyone realized we were truly gone. The next morning, I watched from my bedroom window as Daddy's car disappeared down Elm Street, carrying him and Tony toward Atlanta. For the first time in 6 years, I could breathe freely in my own house. Mrs. Wilson had already begun processing the new identity documents. Jessica Randall would disappear forever, replaced by Jessica Smith, a young widow whose husband had died in a factory accident. It was a common enough story that no one would question it. "We can accelerate the timeline," Mrs. Wilson said when I called her that morning. "There's a train leaving Knoxville tomorrow night at 11:47 p.m. bound for Washington. My contact can meet you at Union Station. Tomorrow night, less than 36 hours to freedom." But freedom, I was about to learn, would come at a price I hadn't calculated. The 24 hours that followed were the longest of my life. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. I packed and repacked our few belongings, trying to decide what could safely be taken without arousing suspicion. Mama moved through the house like a woman preparing for her own funeral gathering, small mementos and keepsakes that might help me remember happier times. "Take this," she said, pressing her mother's silver locket into my hands. "It's the only thing of value I have, but more than that, it's been in our family for 3 generations. I want Charles to have something good from his heritage." I fastened the locket around my neck, feeling the weight of generations of women who had loved and sacrificed and endured. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching Charles crawl around on a blanket, Mama spoke the words that would haunt me for years to come. "Jessica, I need you to promise me something." "Anything, Mama." "Promise me you'll give that boy the childhood you never had." Promise me he'll grow up knowing he's loved and wanted and safe. I promise. And promise me, her voice broke, that you'll forgive me someday for not being strong enough to protect you.
I took her weathered hands in mine, these hands that had worked so hard and endured so much.
Mama, you're the strongest person I know. You survived Daddy's fists and Tony's evil and still found ways to show me love. Don't you ever doubt that. At 10:30 p.m., Mrs. Wilson's car appeared in the alley behind our house, headlights off, engine barely audible. It was time. The goodbye with Mama was the hardest thing I'd ever done. We held each other in the darkness, both of us knowing this might be the last time we'd see each other in this life. Write to me, she whispered. Send letters to Eleanor's address. I need to know you're safe. I will, Mama, I promise.
Take care of that precious boy. Give him everything we couldn't give you.
As I walked away from that house, carrying Charles and a single suitcase that contained our entire future, I felt the weight of endings and beginnings pressing down on me. Behind me lay 15 years of pain, abuse, and terror. Ahead lay the unknown, terrifying in its uncertainty, but glorious in its possibility. The drive to Knoxville passed in tense silence. Mrs. Wilson had thought of everything: tickets purchased under my new name, a private compartment, arranged supplies for the journey packed in a discreet bag. At the station, she pressed a sealed envelope into my hands. Don't open this until you're safely in Washington, she instructed. It contains everything you'll need to start your new life. I don't know how to thank you, I said, tears streaming down my face. Give that boy a good life, Jessica. That's all the thanks I need. As the train pulled away from the station, carrying us toward Washington and freedom, I pressed my face to the window and watched Tennessee disappear into the darkness. Somewhere in that fading landscape was the broken girl I used to be, but she was staying behind. Jessica Smith was going to Washington to build something beautiful from the ashes of Jessica Randall's destruction. But the past, as I would learn, has a way of reaching forward when you least expect it. Washington, D.C. in March 1966 was a revelation of possibility. Buildings reached toward heaven in ways that seemed impossible, and the sheer number of people was overwhelming in the most wonderful way. For the first time in my life, I was anonymous, just another young mother in a city full of stories. Margaret Chen met us at Union Station with the efficiency Mrs. Wilson had promised. Petite and professional, she radiated competence and kindness in equal measure. Welcome to Washington, Jessica. I'm Margaret, and this must be Charles. She smiled at my son, who was staring at the massive terminal with wide, curious eyes. He's beautiful. The residential facility in DuPont Circle housed 23 women and their children, all refugees from various forms of domestic violence. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who understood trauma without needing explanations. There was Rosa from El Salvador, who'd fled an abusive husband with her 3 children. Linda, whose stepfather had been selling her to his friends since she was 12. Maria, who'd escaped a trafficking situation that began when her own brother sold her for drug money. Each story was heartbreaking, but there was strength in our shared experience. We understood each other's nightmares, each other's hypervigilance, each other's fierce determination to build something better. My room was small but private, just a bed, dresser, and crib for Charles. After sharing space with Tony for so many years, having a door that locked felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. Margaret enrolled me in secretarial school, where I learned to type 60 words per minute and manage office systems. You're a natural, she told me after I mastered filing systems and phone protocols. Any employer would be lucky to have you. The child care program allowed me to focus on learning without worrying about Charles. He thrived in the facility's nursery, playing with children his age and forming friendships untainted by family trauma. After 4 months of training, Margaret helped me secure my first real job, receptionist at Peterson & Associates, a small law firm downtown. The partners, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Klein, treated me with respect and professionalism that felt revolutionary after a lifetime of being dismissed and devalued. You're an asset to this firm, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Peterson told me during my first performance review. We're genuinely pleased with your work, Mrs. Smith. Even after months of using the name, it still thrilled me to hear it. Jessica Smith had no shameful past, no terrible secrets. She was simply a young widow working hard to support her son. By Charles's second birthday, I'd saved enough to move us into our own apartment, a tiny one-bedroom place in a safe neighborhood with good schools. It felt like a palace after the crowded facility. I decorated Charles's corner with bright colors and educational toys, creating a space that radiated joy and security. On the walls, I hung pictures of our new life, no family photos from Tennessee, no reminders of the darkness we'd escaped. For 18 months, I allowed myself to believe we were truly free. Charles was happy and healthy. I was building a career, and our future stretched ahead bright with possibility. But freedom, as I was about to discover, was more fragile than I'd dared to imagine. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October 1967, shattering the peaceful routine I'd worked so hard to build. I was typing legal briefs when our receptionist informed me I had an urgent phone call. Jessica Smith. The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a slight southern accent that made my blood freeze. Yes, this is Jessica. This is Detective Ray Michaels with the Oak Ridge Police Department. I'm calling about an ongoing investigation. We have reason to believe you might have information relevant to our case. My hands began shaking so violently, I nearly dropped the phone. After 2.5 years of safety, they'd found me. I'm not sure what you mean, I managed to say.
Ma'am, we're investigating several serious allegations against Tony Randall, sexual assault charges involving multiple minors. We understand you lived in the same household and might have witnessed inappropriate behavior.
Tony had been arrested. After all these years, other victims had finally come forward. But why were they contacting me now? I moved away years ago. I don't know anything that could help. Mrs. Smith, we have reason to believe that you are Jessica Randall, Tony's sister, who disappeared from Oak Ridge in 1965. We need to speak with you about what you may have observed during your time in that household. The room spun around me. How had they connected Jessica Smith to Jessica Randall? The documentation had been perfect, the transformation complete. I think there's been some mistake, I whispered.
Ma'am, we can do this the easy way, or we can involve federal authorities, but either way, we need to talk. Your testimony could be crucial in putting away a dangerous predator.
I hung up and ran to the bathroom where I promptly vomited everything I'd eaten that morning. This couldn't be happening. Not now, when Charles was finally safe and happy. But even as panic threatened to consume me, another emotion began to grow, a burning need for justice. Tony was finally facing consequences for his crimes, and I had the power to ensure he paid for every victim he'd ever hurt. That evening, I called Margaret Chen and explained the situation. Her reaction was immediate and protective. How did they find you?
Your documentation was foolproof. I don't know, but they did. The question is, what do I do now? That's entirely up to you, Jessica. You could cooperate with the investigation and help put Tony away permanently. Or you could refuse to get involved and try to maintain your current identity.
The choice seemed impossible. Cooperate and risk exposure, potentially losing Charles if the truth came out. Or stay silent and let Tony possibly escape justice free to hurt other children. But as I looked at Charles now, a bright, curious 2-year-old with his father's dark hair, but my gentle eyes, I knew what I had to do. I thought of all the girls Tony might have abused since I left all the future victims who deserved protection.
I'll cooperate, I said finally, but I have conditions.
What kind of conditions? Complete protection for my son's identity and paternity. Whatever it takes to keep him safe from the truth about his conception. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Jessica, there's something you should know. The investigation is more extensive than you might realize. Multiple victims have come forward spanning nearly a decade. Tony isn't just facing charges for recent crimes, they're looking at a pattern of abuse dating back to the early 1960s. My heart stopped. What does that mean for me? It means they probably already suspect more than they're letting on.
and it means your testimony could be the key to ensuring he never hurts another child. The flight back to Tennessee felt like traveling backward through time. With each mile that brought us closer to Oak Ridge, I felt Jessica Smith's carefully constructed confidence eroding, replaced by the fear and helplessness that had defined Jessica Randall's existence. Charles sat on my lap coloring in a book while I stared out at clouds and farmland, trying to prepare for what lay ahead. Margaret had arranged everything meticulously. I would testify via closed-circuit television from a secure location, so Tony couldn't see me or learn my current whereabouts. Detective Michaels met us at the Knoxville airport, a kind-faced man who reminded me of the father I'd always wished I'd had. He was gentle with Charles, offering him a junior police badge sticker and making small talk about airplanes. "What we appreciate your courage in coming forward, Mrs. Smith," he said as we drove toward the secure facility where my testimony would be recorded. "Your evidence is crucial to establishing a pattern of predatory behavior."
Has he hurt many others? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. 7 girls that we know of, ranging in age from 8 to 15. All with similar stories, isolated, vulnerable children, with no one to believe them or protect them.
The number hit me like a physical blow. 7 other girls. 7 other children who had suffered the same horrors I'd endured while I was safely building a new life in Washington.
Could I have stopped it? I asked quietly. If I'd stayed, if I'd kept fighting.
"No," Detective Michaels said firmly. "You were a child yourself, Jessica, a victim with no power and no resources. Getting yourself and your son to safety was exactly the right choice."
The testimony took 3 days to complete. Sitting in that sterile room with cameras and recording equipment, I told my story to a courtroom full of strangers via video link. I described years of abuse in clinical detail, explaining how Tony had used threats and intimidation to maintain control. But I was careful to omit certain crucial details, most importantly Charles's true paternity. I presented myself as a sister who had witnessed Tony's crimes against other children, not as one of his primary victims. The prosecutor, District Attorney Hamilton, was thorough but compassionate. She understood the trauma involved and worked to make the process bearable. The defense attorney tried every trick in his playbook to discredit my testimony, suggesting I was motivated by family grudges or seeking attention. But the evidence was overwhelming, not just my testimony, but 7 other victims with remarkably consistent stories. The most damning evidence came from recordings made in the county jail, where Tony had made several phone calls discussing his legal situation with friends.
"These bitches are trying to destroy me with lies." His voice crackled through the courtroom speakers. "But I know how to handle lying whores. Always have." The casual cruelty in his voice, the complete lack of remorse, spoke volumes about his character. Even some members of the defense team looked uncomfortable as the recording played. When the prosecution rested their case, I felt cautiously optimistic. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony compelling. Surely justice would finally be served. But Tony's lawyer had one more card to play. The phone call came at 6 a.m. the morning after I'd finished testifying, jarring me awake in the hotel room where Charles and I were staying. "Jessica, it's Detective Michaels. We need to meet immediately. Tony's defense team has made some serious allegations that could impact the entire case." Something in his voice made my blood turn to ice.
"What kind of allegations? I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you be at the station in an hour?"
I arranged for Margaret to watch Charles and took a taxi to the police station, my mind racing through possibilities. What could Tony's lawyers have discovered that required an emergency meeting? Detective Michaels met me in an interview room alongside Assistant District Attorney Patricia Vaughn, a sharp-eyed woman with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every form of human corruption imaginable.
"Mrs. Smith," Ada Vaughn began without preamble, "Tony Randall's defense team presented evidence yesterday that calls your testimony into serious question. They claim you have a personal vendetta against their client that goes beyond the crimes you witnessed."
"That's not true," I said quickly. "Everything I testified to was completely accurate."
"Including your claim that you were never personally victimized by Tony Randall." The question hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean?
Ada Vaughn opened a file folder and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table. It showed Charles and me walking together, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Even in the grainy image, Charles's resemblance to Tony was unmistakable.
This is your son, isn't it?
I stared at the photograph, my mouth suddenly dry as sand.
How did you get this?
Tony's attorney hired a private investigator to look into your background. They've been watching you for weeks, Mrs. Smith. They know about your son's paternity, and they're threatening to expose it unless you recant your testimony.
My worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. Everything I'd sacrificed to protect everything I'd built to keep Charles safe was crumbling around me.
Mrs. Smith, Ada Vaughn continued, we need the complete truth. Is Tony Randall the biological father of your child?
I could lie, deny everything, claim it was coincidence. But the photograph made denial impossible, and I could see in their eyes that they already suspected the truth.
Yes,
I whispered. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence.
Ada Vaughn made notes while Detective Michaels looked at me with a mixture of pity and understanding.
How old were you when the sexual relationship began? Ada Vaughn asked.
It wasn't a relationship, I said, finding my voice. It was attack. Systematic, repeated attack that started when I was 9 years old.
Why didn't you include this information in your original testimony?
Because I was trying to protect my son. He doesn't know the truth about his conception, and I was terrified that exposing it would destroy his life.
Ada Vaughn's expression softened slightly.
Mrs. Smith, I understand your desire to protect your child, but your testimony about your own victimization could be the key to putting Tony Randall away for life. Are you willing to amend your statement? I thought about Charles sleeping peacefully back at the hotel. I thought about the 7 other girls whose courage had brought this case to trial. I thought about future victims who deserved protection from the monster who had stolen my childhood. What happens to my son if I tell the truth?
Nothing, Detective Michaels said firmly. Charles is a victim here too, Jessica. No court would remove a child from a loving mother because of the circumstances of his conception. And we can arrange for continued identity protection both for you and Charles.
I closed my eyes and made the hardest decision of my life.
Okay, I'll tell you everything. The expanded testimony took 4 more days. This time, I held nothing back. I described 6 years of systematic abuse in graphic detail, the terror of pregnancy at 14, the desperate flight to Washington with a newborn baby. I explained why I'd created a new identity and kept the truth hidden for so long. It was the most difficult thing I'd ever done, reliving those memories, speaking those words aloud to a room full of strangers. But with each revelation, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The secrets that had poisoned half my life were finally being exposed to light. The defense attorney's attempts to blame me for my own victimization backfired spectacularly. His suggestions that I had somehow seduced Tony as a child were so offensive that even the judge threatened him with contempt.
Your Honor, Ada Vaughn objected during one particularly vicious cross-examination. Defense counsel is attempting to blame a 9-year-old child for the criminal actions of her adult brother. This line of questioning isn't just inappropriate, it's obscene. The most powerful moment came when they played Tony's recorded jailhouse phone calls. Unaware that his conversations were being monitored, he'd bragged to friends about his control over that little bitch Jessica and threatened to reveal what a whore she really was if she didn't back down. The casual cruelty in his voice, the complete absence of remorse, revealed his true character more clearly than any testimony could. Several jury members looked physically ill as the recordings played. When the prosecution rested their case, the defense's response was pathetically weak. They'd built their entire strategy around discrediting me as a vindictive sister, but the revelation of my own victimization had transformed me into their client's primary victim. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with their verdict. On the charge of rape in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of sexual abuse of multiple minors, we find the defendant guilty.
On the charge of incest, we find the defendant guilty. Each guilty verdict crashed over me like a wave of vindication. After 16 years of silence, justice was finally being served. The judge sentenced Tony to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years to be served consecutively. As the bailiffs led him away in shackles, he turned and looked directly at me through the video monitor. The hatred in his cold green eyes was pure and venomous, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. He couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't hurt Charles. He couldn't hurt anyone ever again. That night, I called Mrs. Wilson from the hotel to share the news. "Oh, my dear girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of your courage. So proud of the woman you've become."
"I couldn't have done any of it without you," I told her. "You saved our lives."
"No, Jessica. You saved your own lives. I just provided the opportunity. The strength, the determination, the love for your son that all came from you." As I hung up the phone, I realized she was right. The frightened, powerless girl who had once cowered in Tony's shadow was gone forever, replaced by a woman who could face her demons and emerge victorious. Returning to Washington after the trial felt like awakening from a nightmare into brilliant sunshine. The city I'd come to love welcomed us back with open arms. My job was waiting. Charles's daycare spot was held. Our small apartment remained exactly as we'd left it. But everything was different now. The secrets that had defined my existence for so long were gone, replaced by a freedom I'd never imagined possible. For the first time since Charles's birth, I could look at my son without seeing reminders of his conception. He was simply Charles, my beautiful, innocent boy who deserved every happiness. The trial had attracted significant media attention, and several outlets wanted interviews about my experiences. I declined most requests, but agreed to speak with a Washington Post reporter writing about domestic violence survivors. "Why come forward after all these years?" she asked.
"Because staying silent protects predators," I replied. "Every woman who speaks up makes it easier for the next woman to be believed." I couldn't live with myself knowing Tony might hurt someone else because I was too afraid to tell the truth. The resulting article generated an enormous response. Letters poured in from other survivors sharing their stories and thanking me for giving them hope. Organizations helping abuse victims reached out asking if I'd consider speaking at conferences or helping with their programs. Margaret encouraged me to accept these invitations. "You have a powerful story and the credibility that comes from surviving and thriving. Other women need to hear that escape is possible, that healing is real." So I began speaking at conferences and support groups, sharing my experiences with other survivors. Each time I told my story, it lost more of its power to hurt me, while gaining power to heal others. Charles, meanwhile, continued flourishing. At 3 years old, he was bright, curious, and remarkably resilient. He made friends, easily excelled in preschool, and showed no signs of the trauma that had marked his conception. It was at one of these survivor conferences that I met Robert Harrison, a trauma therapist, whose gentle wisdom and patient understanding would transform my definition of love. Robert had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a warm smile that made me feel safe in ways I'd never experienced. During a break between conference sessions, we bonded over coffee and shared observations about the presentations. "Your story is remarkable," he said after hearing me speak. "Not just what you survived, but what you've built from it. You've transformed trauma into purpose." I had exceptional help along the way. I replied, thinking of Mrs. Wilson and Margaret and all the angels who had guided our escape. "Help only works when someone's ready to accept it. You had the courage to reach for something better, which is rarer than you might think." We began corresponding letters that evolved from professional discussions about trauma recovery to personal conversations about hopes, dreams, and healing. Robert had his own history with family violence,
though it had taken different forms.
My father was an alcoholic who became violent when he drank, which was most nights, he wrote. I spent my childhood protecting my younger sister from his rages. That's what led me to therapy, wanting to help other families break cycles of violence. Our shared understanding created a bond deeper than romance, though that developed too slowly and carefully. Robert never pushed for more intimacy than I was comfortable with, and was wonderfully patient with Charles, who was initially suspicious of any man showing interest in his mother. Is Mr. Robert going to be my new daddy? Charles asked after Robert had taken us to the National Zoo. Would you like that? I asked, curious about his feelings. Charles considered the question with 3-year-old seriousness. Maybe. He's nice to you, and he knows lots about animals and doesn't yell. It was the highest praise a child could give. Robert and I dated for 2 years before he proposed, approaching the subject with characteristic thoughtfulness. I love you, Jessica, and I love Charles too. I'd be honored to be his father in every way that matters. But I understand if you're not ready. Marriage means different things to survivors of trauma. What does it mean to you? Partnership, mutual support, building something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone. A safe harbor in a sometimes dangerous world. That was exactly what I wanted, what I'd been afraid to hope for during all those years of running and hiding. We married in Margaret Chen's garden, surrounded by the chosen family who had sustained us through darkness into light. Charles, now 5, served as ring-bearer, beaming with pride in his miniature tuxedo. Robert legally adopted Charles after our marriage, giving him the Harrison name and all the protections that came with it. Charles was thrilled to have a real daddy, though he maintained gentle curiosity about his first daddy who went to heaven. Now I have 2 daddies, he announced to anyone who would listen. One in heaven and one who lives with us and helps me build Legos. Years passed peacefully. Robert's practice flourished. I earned my social work degree and began helping other domestic violence survivors, and Charles grew into a thoughtful, compassionate teenager who excelled in school and athletics. He never knew that his biological father was serving multiple life sentences for rape and incest. By 1985, Charles was 20 years old and thriving at Georgetown University, studying engineering with plans to specialize in environmental restoration fitting work for someone determined to fix broken things and make the world cleaner. I want to clean up toxic waste sites, he explained during one of our regular Sunday dinners. Help communities that have been poisoned by industrial pollution. There's something satisfying about taking contaminated land and making it healthy again. Robert and I exchanged glances across the table. Our son had no idea how perfectly his career choice reflected his own origins, born from toxicity, but raised in love, transformed into someone dedicated to healing. It was during Charles's junior year that Detective Michaels called with news I'd been dreading yet somehow expecting. Jessica Tony died in prison last night. Another inmate, apparently a father himself, decided to administer his own form of justice after learning about Tony's crimes against children. I felt empty. No satisfaction, no grief, no relief. Tony's death was simply a fact like weather or gravity. He'd been so thoroughly excised from our reality that even his physical death couldn't touch us. How are you handling the news? Detective Michaels asked. I'm not sure I'm handling anything. He stopped existing for us years ago. This just makes it official. I didn't tell Charles about his biological father's death. Tony had never existed in Charles's reality, and I saw no reason to introduce him now, even as a corpse. Instead, I focused on the future we continued building together. Charles graduated summa cum laude, earned a master's degree in environmental engineering, and landed his dream job with the EPA. Robert and I deepened our partnership both personally and professionally, opening a family counseling practice that specialized in helping abuse survivors. Life wasn't perfect. No life ever is. But it was good. It was ours. And it was built on love, rather than fear, hope, rather than shame. But secrets have a way of demanding reckoning, even decades later. The first crack in our carefully maintained facade came in 1995, when Charles was 30. He'd been dating Sarah, a pediatric nurse, for 2 years, and their relationship had grown serious enough for discussions of marriage and children. Mom, I need to ask you something, Charles said during one of our monthly lunch dates. Sarah's been asking about my medical history for genetic counseling, and I realized I don't know much about my biological father's family background. My heart skipped several beats. For 30 years, I'd deflected such questions with vague references to Charles's father dying young in an accident, claiming I'd been too traumatized to keep detailed medical records. What exactly does she need to know? Just basic stuff, any history of heart disease, diabetes, mental illness. Her doctor said it's important for family planning. I managed to provide generic answers that wouldn't raise suspicions, but the conversation planted a seed of worry. As Charles and Sarah's relationship progressed toward marriage, these questions would inevitably intensify. The second crack appeared 6 months later, when Sarah, researching genealogy as a hobby, offered to help Charles trace his paternal lineage. "It's such interesting work," she told me excitedly during a family barbecue. "I've already found some fascinating connections in my own family tree. Charles's father's family must have interesting stories too." "Oh, I wouldn't know where to begin," I deflected. "It was all so long ago and I was so young when he died." But Sarah was persistent and methodical, qualities that made her excellent at her job but dangerous to our secret. She began making casual inquiries about my time in Tennessee, asking seemingly innocent questions about Charles's early years. The final crack came in early 1996, when Charles announced his engagement to Sarah and began planning their wedding. "We want to incorporate some traditions from both families," he explained. "Sarah's researching ways to honor deceased parents in wedding ceremonies. She thinks it would be meaningful to include some reference to my father." The walls were closing in. 31 years after fleeing Tennessee, the truth was threatening to surface just when Charles had found his own happiness. But the actual revelation would come from a source none of us anticipated. The Washington Post article appeared on a Sunday morning in March 1996, buried on page 7 of the Metro section under the headline, "Local Advocates' Decades-Long Fight Against Abuse." It was a feature story about my work with domestic violence survivors, written by the same journalist who'd interviewed me years earlier about Tony's trial. I was making coffee when Charles called, his voice strange and strained. "Mom, you need to see today's Post. There's an article about you." My blood froze. "What kind of article?" "Just, can you come over? Sarah and I are here and we need to talk." The drive to Charles's apartment felt like traveling toward my own execution. For over 3 decades, I'd lived in terror of this moment when the carefully constructed lies would crumble, and Charles would learn the truth about his conception. I found them sitting at his kitchen table, the newspaper spread between them. The article was thorough and well-researched, detailing my transformation from victim to advocate. But buried in the middle was a paragraph that shattered everything. Smith's advocacy work stems from personal experience surviving attack by her older brother, beginning when she was 9 years old. Smith fled Tennessee with her infant son to build a new life in Washington. Her brother, Tony Randall, was later convicted of multiple sexual assault charges and died in prison in 1985. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Charles's face was pale, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and dawning understanding. "Is this true?" he asked quietly. I could lie. Could claim the journalist had gotten the facts wrong, that it was someone else's story. But looking at my son, this good, kind man I'd raised with such love, I knew the lies had to end. "Yes," I whispered. Sarah reached for Charles's hand while he processed this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Tony Randall was my biological father. Your brother." "Yes." "You were 14 when I was born." "Yes." "He raped you." "Yes." Charles closed his eyes, and I watched 30 years of carefully constructed identity crumble in real time. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "All those years when I asked about my father, when I wondered why I didn't look like Dad Robert, you let me believe he was a hero who died young." "Charles, I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" His voice rose slightly. "From what? From knowing the truth about myself?" Sarah squeezed his hand, her nurse's training evident in her calm demeanor. "Charles, honey, this doesn't change who you are." "Doesn't it?"
He looked at her with anguished eyes. My father was a rapist who abused children. What if I carry those genes? What if I pass them on to our children? That's not how it works, Sarah said firmly. Trauma and abuse aren't genetic. You are who you choose to be, not who your biological father was. Charles turned back to me, his expression a mixture of hurt and love that broke my heart. Mom, I understand why you kept this secret. I do. But I need time to process this, to figure out how it changes things. It doesn't have to change anything, I pleaded. You're still you, still the wonderful man Robert and I raised. Still, I know. Charles stood and came around the table to embrace me. I love you, Mom. That hasn't changed. But I need some space to work through this. As I drove home through tears, I wondered if I'd finally lost the son I'd sacrificed everything to protect.
The weeks that followed were the most difficult since our flight from Tennessee. Charles avoided family dinners, kept our phone conversations brief and superficial, and threw himself into wedding planning with Sarah as if staying busy could somehow outrun the truth. Robert, bless him, became my anchor during this storm. He's processing trauma, he explained in his gentle therapist voice. Learning that your entire origin story was a lie is incredibly destabilizing. Give him time.
What if he never forgives me? What if I've lost him forever?
Jessica, you raised that boy with more love and sacrifice than most children ever receive. He knows that. He just needs time to integrate this new information with everything he thought he knew about himself. The breakthrough came 6 weeks later on a rainy Thursday evening. Charles appeared at our door unannounced, looking exhausted but determined. We need to talk, he said. All of us. We gathered in our living room, the same space where we'd shared thousands of happy family moments, and Charles spoke with quiet intensity. I've been seeing a counselor, he began. Someone who specializes in family trauma, and I've learned some things about myself and about our family that I want to share. He paused, gathering his thoughts. First, I want you to know that learning the truth was devastating. Not because it changed how I feel about you, Mom, but because it made me realize how much pain you've carried alone all these years. Tears began flowing down my face. Second, I understand now why you kept this secret. You weren't just protecting me from difficult knowledge. You were protecting me from a legacy of violence and shame that you refused to let define our family. Robert reached for my hand as Charles continued. Third, I want to thank you for every lie you told, every deflection, every careful construction that let me grow up believing I was wanted and loved and safe. Because I was all those things, regardless of how I was conceived. Charles, I began, but he held up a hand. I'm not finished. Sarah and I have been doing a lot of talking and research. We've learned that children born from sexual assault can live completely normal, healthy lives when they're raised with love and support. The circumstances of conception don't determine character or potential. He moved to sit beside me on the couch, taking my hands in his. You turned something horrific into something beautiful. You took a pregnancy that represented the worst of humanity and raised a child who tries every day to represent the best of it. That's not just motherhood, that's alchemy. I was sobbing now, 30 years of fear and guilt and protective love pouring out in great cleansing waves. I love you, Mom. I love Dad Robert. I love the family we created from ashes and determination and hope. And I want my children to know their grandmother as the warrior woman who broke generational cycles of abuse and built something beautiful in their place. Charles pulled me into a fierce embrace, and I felt decades of protective fear finally release their grip on my heart. There's one more thing, he said softly. Sarah and I want you to know that we're planning to name our first daughter Jessica if we're blessed with children, because you've shown us what it means to love someone more than your own life. Today is Charles's wedding day. My son, now 31, tall and handsome, and radiating the kind of confident joy that comes from knowing you are deeply loved, is marrying Sarah in the garden behind our house, surrounded by the chosen family that has sustained us through darkness into light. As I watch Charles adjust his tie nervously while waiting for his bride to appear, I think about the journey that brought us to this moment. From that terrified 14-year-old girl hiding her pregnancy in small-town Tennessee, to this celebration of love and hope, it seems impossible that this could be the same story. But it is. Pain and healing trauma and recovery fear and courage, they're all part of the same human experience. The difference lies in what we choose to build from the rubble of our broken places. I built love. I built safety. I built a future where children are protected and women are believed and families are defined by choice rather than genetics. Sarah appears at the garden gate in her grandmother's wedding dress, and Charles's face transforms with pure joy. As they exchange vows they've written for each other, I hear Charles speak words that echo through generations. Sarah, I promise to love you with the fierce protective love my mother showed me. I promise to build with you a family defined by choice and commitment rather than blood and biology. I promise that our children will grow up knowing they are wanted, valued, and safe.
During the reception, Charles pulls me aside for a private moment.
Mom, he says, his eyes bright with tears of joy. I need you to know something. Whatever DNA I carry from my biological father, whatever genetic material came from that darkness, it doesn't matter. Because you raised me with so much love, so much light, that any darkness was completely overwhelmed. He pauses, taking my hands in his. You didn't just save me from Tony Randall. You saved me from ever becoming him. You broke chains that had probably bound our family for generations, and you did it with nothing but love and determination.
Charles, no, let me finish. I used to wonder why I was born, what purpose my life could have when it began in such horror. Now I know. I was born so you could prove that love is stronger than violence, that hope can triumph over despair, that one woman's courage can change the trajectory of an entire family line.
As I watch Charles dance with his new wife surrounded by friends and chosen family who celebrate their love without reservation, I marvel at the transformation. The scared girl who once believed she was worthless has raised a son who radiates worth and purpose. The secret I carried for 31 years, the shame that nearly destroyed me, has been transformed into a testimony of survival and redemption. The truth that I feared would shatter our family has actually strengthened it, creating deeper bonds built on authentic love rather than protective lies. Charles and Sarah will have children someday. Beautiful, wanted children who will grow up hearing stories about their brave grandmother who turned trauma into triumph. They'll never know their biological grandfather's name or crimes, but they'll know that their very existence is proof that light can emerge from darkness. That night, as Robert and I clean up after the celebration, I find a note Charles has left on my dresser. Mom, thank you for loving me before I was born, for protecting me when I was helpless, for raising me to believe in goodness despite experiencing evil. Thank you for showing me that our worth isn't determined by our worst moments, but by our choice to keep loving anyway. You didn't just survive, you transformed everything you touched. That's the legacy I want to pass on to my children. All my love, Charles. As I fold the note and place it in my jewelry box next to Mama's silver locket, I think about legacy, not the broken chains of violence and shame that define the Randall family, but the golden threads of love and healing that will define the Harrison family for generations to come. Outside, the stars shine over Washington like promises kept. Somewhere in Tennessee lie the graves of John and Tony Randall, their legacy of violence buried with them. But here, in this house, filled with love and laughter, a different legacy continues, one built on the radical premise that every child deserves protection, that every woman deserves belief, that every family can choose love over fear. The monsters of my past are dead and buried, but love, transformative, redemptive, eternal love,
that lives on in every choice Charles makes, every child he'll raise, every person he'll help heal. We are more than the sum of our traumas. We are the architects of our own redemption. And sometimes, if we're very brave and very lucky, we get to see the beautiful structures we've built from the ashes of our breaking. This is that story. This is that love. This is that hope made manifest in a son who will never know darkness because his mother chose to be his light.